Willkommen in einem meiner Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 27 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll be covering basing Napoleonic figures, not how to do this, as I'm assuming you'll by now be fully experienced at doing the actual physical basing, but the size of the base and the number of figures per base. This clearly is dependent on the rules being used, but the objective is to identify the most common basing guideline which will be useful for as many rules as possible. In order to determine the optimal base sizes to use, let's look at base sizes used in different rules. For simplicity, I'll only be covering basing for 15mm figures, which these days tends to be the base size used for 6mm as well. The starting point, as with so many of my videos, will be the WRG Wargame Rules 1685 to 1845, which is rather old but nonetheless very popular. Back in 1979, the bases were 3 centimeters wide, which we will discover is no longer common, but we all need to start somewhere. Most elements are 3 centimeters wide using these rules, with a depth which ranges from between 1 centimeter and 2 centimeters. There are many elements such as artillery which have a reduced width. However, this type of basing is no longer used, so I'll ignore those elements. Artillery depth ranges from 2 centimeters to 6 centimeters. Artillery is normally based 1 per base with associated crew, limbers and horses. The other troops are based in what used to be called close order, order and open order, which is 4 figures, 3 figures and 2 figures respectively. The first point to make is these sizes are not common anymore. Figure size has grown so much, in many cases they simply do not fit onto this base size. Empire 3rd edition uses inches for basing sizes, so I'll convert them into the closest metric, with 1 inch equaling 3 centimeters, which I know is more than 1 inch, but anyway, let's go with this. It's not 100% correct, but is common with micro armor rules, so let's use it here. Empire allows for individual figures to be base, so to achieve a level of consistency, let's use our close order, order and open order densities. Infantry in close order, 4 per base, have a frontage of 1 1/8 inches, which can be rounded to 3 centimeters, and a depth of ½ inch, which is 1.5 centimeters. Infantry in open order, 2 per base, have a frontage of 1 inch, which makes it, well, 2.5, but let's call it 3 centimeters, and a depth of ½ inch. Most cavalry in open order, 2 to a base, have a frontage of 1.5 inches, which makes it 4.5 centimeters, and a depth of whatever is required. Some cavalry in open order, 2 to a base, have a frontage of 1 inch, which makes it 3 centimeters. Actually, technically 2.5, but let's go with 3. With elan, we begin to see base widths of 4 centimeters with increased base depths. These rules came out in 2004, so this is no surprise, as the increase in size of 15mm figures caused an increase in base size for ancients and Napoleonics, or actually for Napoleonics was more of an indirect effect, but was certainly an impact. However, we still have this variable base width with open order cavalry. DBN possesses 2 basing systems, the original, based on the original DBA, I assume, and an updated one which came out with DBN 2.1. This shows the original basing system, which is heavily based on DBA. When DBA came out originally in March 1990, it used the new base sizes first used in WRG 7th edition. The only exception was the use of 1 1/2 centimeter deep bases for close order infantry, which was abandoned. The new base sizes simply allowed players to increase the depth of their elements by adding a second line of figures behind the first line. This was done purely for aesthetic reasons, and I'll ignore it for the moment. Von Krieg, being a hex-based set of rules, has no real element size, but the following are suggested. Each unit is made up of 2 elements, which are 3 centimeters wide, with a low figure density, which is similar to the 4 centimeter bases of DBN. Garde du Corps uses the same basing system which the later version of Empire 3rd edition used, and which Napoleon Battles also uses. The rules can accommodate War Eagles, which uses the same width, but have a much deeper base for infantry, being 3 centimeters, and cavalry being 4 centimeters. Looking at a list of other rules which are not big base rules, the base sizes range a great deal, with the size not being very important in most cases. Sizes of about 1 centimeter wide per infantry figure seems the most common, but even that can be highly variable. I suppose this is due to the desire to create historically accurate sized units, which means single figures are common. Rules such as Bloody Big Battles, CCC and Bitchute have no real base size recommendation, but in games of BBB for Napoleonics I often see base sizes similar to DBN. We're now looking at DBMM, and you may ask yourself, why are we looking at ancient set of rules in our discussion? The reason is, in the UK at least, basing for Napoleonics often follows ancient basing. DBMM came out in 2010. A later set of rules is DBA, which came out in 2014. The first interesting trends was all depths of 1.5 centimetres could also be 2 centimetres. So the new standard depth for infantry was becoming 2 centimetres. The second change was a double element, where the elements were double depth and allowed a doubling number of figures on each element. This was not available to all figure types, so this could be a specific rules feature. The first conclusion is 4 centimetres seems to be the standard or most common base width, or at least 1 centimetre per figure. The infantry depth could be either 1.5 centimetres or 2 centimetres, depending on the figure. I'd personally go with 2 centimetres, as larger base sizes are easier to move and allow for more diorama to be placed on them. But the biggest reason is some of my Prussian line infantry require 2 centimetres to avoid their guns overhanging, and the overhanging is very annoying. 15mm figures today are closer to 18mm figures. Artillery is interesting. The whole base, including the transport, should be 8 centimetres deep. But as I like having the limber separate, I would base the artillery on a 4 centimetre deep base. The transports range from 4 centimetres to 8 centimetre depth, depending on the size of transports. These days I actually base my artillery 3 centimetres deep in order to align with cavalry. In the micro armour world, the most important measurement is width, with the depth being anything which can accommodate the figure. I tend to like this principle, however the figure playing rules need to be able to accommodate this, so always check the rules carefully. Let's now look at figure density. The easiest is for artillery, 1 gun with crew per base. It's all you can fit. If the guns are very small, such as 2-pounders, perhaps you could place 2 on a base, but as I do not use this weapon, I have no idea if it's reasonable, and I suspect it may not be. Let's now look at cavalry. 4 figures per base is something a number of rules use. However, I feel this is unreasonable for 2 reasons. It assumes cavalry front line density is the same as line infantry, which is not correct. However, the main reason is many cavalry figures are simply too wide for this type of density. As a result, I've come to the conclusion 3 figures per base is the maximum possible density you should consider. 2 figures per base is the other option, which I tend to prefer. The issue is, what does this represent? If we use DBN as an example, heavy cavalry, which probably includes medium cavalry, could be 3 per base and all light cavalry 2 per base. Of course, what is light cavalry in DBA, as hussar lights, for example? But the big question, what about lancers? Are they light? Are they medium? Should they be 2? Should they be 3? These days I tend to just stay with 2 figures per base for simplicity. Let's look in a bit more detail on this cavalry basing concept. The DBN definition is as follows. Heavy cavalry are Napoleonic knights or mounted shock troops of all armies. Such is the momentum of their charge that when victorious they always pursue a defeated enemy 1 base width, which may not be very helpful definition for basing. I currently think if uncertain, then it depends on the figure type. If it's too wide, then always select 2. If not, think about it a bit. This shows my current suggestions. The number in the top left is an option that you can have. So I'm suggesting carbineers, cuirassiers, dragoons are 3 to a base, hussars, chasseurs de chevals are 2 to a base. When we move to infantry, then musketeers or line infantry are always going to be 4 figures per base. Light infantry is a bit of conundrum because in WRG they normally say 3 to a base, which indicates they're light. But in reality, when they were in line, they had the same density as line infantry. So I tend to leave it at 4 to a base and then have an option where you can have 2 to a base skirmish elements, which you can basically take a close order element off and put the 2 open order. Most rules should be able to support that. Jagers, that is troops which are never in close order, is always going to be 2 per base. The one interesting idea that I discovered during this research was the idea of basing two ranks of figures. This is an idea which DBM suggests in its optional rules in order to make your army look nicer. First point, this is not two elements joined together in order to make it easier to handle element. This is a standard single element which is slightly deeper in order to allow you to base two ranks of infantry. I think they probably copied this from US Napoleonic basing, which tends to be 2 centimeters wide and 3 deep and 2 ranks, 2 figures front, 2 figures in the rear. In DBN, the suggestion is the base depth is increased from 2 centimeters to 2.5 centimeters. If the figures fit, then yeah, this is reasonable. However, I personally feel the base depth should be the same as cavalry. If the rules can handle 2.5 centimeters, then it should be able to handle 3 centimeters. This picture strongly implies this player has adopted that strategy for some of their bases. However, some figures will not even fit a depth of 3 centimeters, so it's a player preference, but one I will consider for my older, smaller minifig Prussians. For new armies, I'll not adopt this idea as the figures are simply too large to do 2 ranks on even 3 centimeter depth. My final comment is if you want your elements to look better, go down the 6 mil path. That is in terms of diorama. However, even though I don't think the DBN depth is reasonable, one thought I've been playing with is double depth bases. If the rules encourage players to deploy elements one behind each other, then it may be useful to create double depth bases, thus making it easy to move bases. This looks good and makes your elements easy to move. However, this greatly depends on the rules being used. For Napoleonics, I currently feel this may not be viable unless you have a lot of figures. However, I have to admit, for some of the rules I'm using these days, which are board game conversions into a figure gaming format, the idea of having a 4 centimeter square base for everything is viable, and it's something I certainly will consider in the future. Ultimately, the whole idea of the double basing is to make your army look nicer, which is a very valid objective for figure gamers. If you have more figures than you need, then this may be something players would find rather attractive, although I must admit I would prefer it if it was actually part of the mechanics of the rules, which is kind of why I tend to prefer the US basing for Napoleonics, which is basically 3 centimeter depth, 2 centimeter width, 2 figures up front, 2 figures in the rear. Let's now look at half bases. Many early rules use half bases for skirmishes. For some scales, this may be viable. However, I prefer to deploy skirmishes on a standard base, but with only 2 figures per base. This looks better and, well, let's say it looks more realistic. Skirmishers did not maintain a frontage of 2 feet per man, they spread out. This requires players to have separate skirmish elements, but in the standard force mix of 50 elements, you probably only need a maximum of 12 skirmish elements, so it's reasonably viable to have these double elements. As part of a way of trying to identify what is possible, let's now ignore official rules basing for the moment and look at what is physically possible and possibly look at their pros and cons, mainly from an aesthetic point of view. I'm only going to be focusing with infantry because line infantry make up the bulk of any Napoleonic force. So starting with a single figure, this needs 1 centimeter wide by 2 centimeters deep to fit most oversized or all oversized 15mm figures that are available these days. The depth could be as low as 1.5 centimeters if you're using older true 15mm figures, or even 13mm or 10mm figures. But I'm assuming we are all purchasing new 15mm figures, and these, for the most part, need a depth of 2 centimeters, particularly if the figure is firing a gun. Using this basic building block, this allows us to create 2 centimeter wide, 3 centimeter wide, or 4 centimeter wide bases. Many rules use the 4 centimeter wide bases, and some rules use 3 centimeter wide bases. In the distant past, some rules did use 2 centimeter bases, as we can see here, but these days this width is normally used if you double rank the figures. On the left, this shows an example of a double ranked 2 centimeter wide base, which ends up being 3 centimeters deep. This actually works well and looks good, but the base depth limits the figures you can place on these bases, as I've discovered. You need to restrict yourself to figures which have the guns pointing upwards, such as if the figure is marching or charging forward. This is the same issue as the DBM double rank figures. This shows what you can see here, the most common basing for line infantry available today, with the left showing what I call US basing, the right what I call UK basing, and the centre is used in some rules or miscellaneous rules, which I typically don't use myself. If we are using a higher scale set of rules, those rules designed to recreate an entire historical battle on a playing area which does not exceed 4 by 6 feet and likely should be smaller, and which can last or lasts no longer than 6 hours, you can consider square bases, as those rules normally accommodate those style of bases. This shows square bases. Now, it's not viable to have a 2 centimetre square base, so the 2 by 3 is about, that's centimetres, is about the best option available. This actually works very well, and I'm basing a Napoleonic force mix along these lines for a wide range of rules. And actually this base size accommodates the more tactical type of rules, which require you to form lines, squares, columns, and also this higher scale set of rules as well. For 3 centimetre bases, it's also possible to have a 3 centimetre square base, but you are limited in the figures you can use, as with the 2 centimetre by 3 centimetre deep base on the left. No one better be firing a musket, otherwise they will not fit. Finally, a 4 centimetre square, or when we achieve this, we do reach some form of sweet spot, particularly with more modern 15mm figures, which are really 18mm. There is plenty of room to place 2 ranks of any figure you desire, and I personally feel this base looks really good. But the rules do need to support square bases, otherwise this is not viable. If you're going to be playing sets of rules which require you to form up in columns and lines, then square bases is probably, or this size square base is probably not where you want to go. And so this concludes episode 27 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case, how should I base my Napoleonic figures? I'll now order some bases and start the process. One aspect I did not cover is the thickness of the base. I normally use 3mm bases for 6mm micro armor because it allows me to label the edge and pick up the base, mainly pick up the base. But for 15mm Napoleonics, I always go with 2mm base thickness. One other issue is that this whole topic has evolved a great deal for me, and these days I'm rapidly adopting US Napoleonic basing, which this video didn't really cover in any great detail. However, saying that, I will always retain my old, what I call UK-based figures, which are typically for infantry, line infantry, 4 centimetres wide, 2 centimetres deep, because I still use them for a whole bunch of different rules. And it tends to be applicable for a wide range of commonly used rules, even the old WRG rules, DBN, bloody big Napoleonic battles, you name it. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.